Good morning, everyone. I hope you're here with good ears and sharp eyes this morning. I'm Bill Sullivan. I'm the moderator for today's program. And this is our sixth and final lecture for Osher at Dartmouth Summer Lecture Series. And of course, our theme this year has been preserving our four freedoms. On behalf of Osher at Dartmouth, I'd like to welcome all of you in person today, as well as I understand about 300 people online with us today as well. I also want to welcome our sister Osher Lifelong Learning Institutes at Brandeis University, the University of Connecticut, the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia, the University of Massachusetts in Boston, Mass., the University of Michigan, the University of Richmond in Virginia, University of Rhode Island, University of Virginia, and Towson University, which is where one of my granddaughters will be a senior this year. A lot of work goes into producing and supporting each summer lecture series, and we especially want to thank the members of the 2025 Summer Lecture Series Committee. Also, the dinner hosts who put on a dinner for the speakers each evening before they're going to talk. The volunteers working today to help us escort all of you in. The Lebanon Opera House for hosting this year's Summer Lecture Series. And the Lebanon Opera House technical support staff and the Junction Arts and Media for their live streaming technical help today. And the Osher Dartmouth staff, without whom we could never pull all of this off each year. And to, of course, today's speaker, Linda Fowler, who I'll introduce in a moment. And our special thanks to sponsors of this year's Summer Lecture Series for their financial support, which is essential in order to make all this happen. Our platinum sponsor is the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, and our gold sponsors are Doyle and Lohman, Kendall at Hanover, the Village at White River Junction, and our bronze sponsors for today's lecture are King Arthur Baking, known to most of us as King Arthur Flour, and the TSS Advisors. For those of you here in the audience, please silence your iPhones. And please pay attention to the exits. In case of an emergency, we never know when ICE might show up. For those in the Opera House today, please write any of the questions you have on the 3x5 cards, which are available at a table into the rear. There's also some here in front. Put your cards, after you've written your question, into those baskets, and they will be given to me, and I will be sorting through them downstairs during the break. For those of you online, type your questions into the chat window on the screen that you are looking at. And a question and answer period will take place following the intermission. The intermission will be for 30 minutes. There are cookies and coffee and tea downstairs. And that will start the question and answer session about 10:30 a.m. back right here. There will be a post-lecture discussion immediately following today's lecture, and that'll take place at the Osher classrooms. If you go out the front of the Opera House, turn right, one block down, you'll see the building where Three Tomatoes is, and the Osher classrooms are upstairs in that building. And that will start about at 11:45 and last until about 12:15 in the Osher classrooms. Now let me introduce today's speaker. She will be with us in a second. And that is Professor Linda Fowler. Professor Fowler has served at Dartmouth College as a professor of government and the Frank Reagan Chair in Policy Studies, as well as Director of Dartmouth's Nelson Rockefeller Center for Public Policy and Social Sciences. And although she officially retired in 2014, she remains very active as a scholar, researcher, and lecturer. And prior to coming to Dartmouth, Dr. Fowler was a professor of political science at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. She holds her bachelor's degree from Smith College and her master's and PhD from the University of Rochester. Prior to getting her PhD, Linda worked in the US government, in the Environmental Protection Agency, and for a member of the United States House of Representatives. So she's got a depth of experience to address this subject today. She's received multiple awards for teaching and scholarship and has published 3 books and scores of articles and book chapters on the US Congress, political interest groups, and United States elections. Her principal expertise is on political institutions in the United States and how they affect the behavior of political actors, such as members of the United States Congress, US Congress overseeing US foreign policy. In fact, one of her most recent books, which you can get in Amazon among a lot of other places, is entitled Watchdogs on the Hill: The Decline of Congressional Oversight of US Foreign Relations. And perhaps Professor Fowler will soon update that to include domestic relations as well. I cannot think of anyone better qualified than Professor Linda Fowler to be the wrap-up speaker for Osher at Dartmouth's Summer Lecture Series on the 4 Freedoms. Please join me in welcoming Professor Fowler.
Well, good morning. What a great day to talk about the way forward in this troubled political time. I'm delighted to be here. I thank Bill for a lovely introduction, and I thank all of you for coming. This is an interesting time for me. I was asked to give the first lecture of this series, and I wasn't able to because of scheduling conflicts, but also I was a little worried about talking about the 4 freedoms because only 2 of them are in the US Constitution. And I thought, well, that could be a problem. But it looked like the speakers have done a wonderful job. And so in many ways, I feel as if my decision to come last was not a very smart one. First of all, I didn't get a freedom to talk about. Instead, I had this broad topic about the way forward. But secondly, I've ended up having to follow a roster of really impressive people. And I think you all must feel that you've had a very rewarding experience, and you should thank the Osher Committee, some of whom I had dinner with last night, and they've really worked so hard, and it shows with the quality of this program. It's interesting to me, though, that I wanted the opportunity to think more broadly about what's happening in our country. And the Osher Committee has given me that opportunity. But it's also, I figured it was high time that I had a better reply when people ask me, what's going on in the United States? And what do you think is going to happen? And my reply so far is not a very satisfactory one. It's been, well, things will get worse before they can get better. So I thought after 50 plus years of teaching, writing, researching, hanging out with politicians, that I should be able to do better than that. So this is my opportunity to try and do better. This is an unprecedented time in American politics from what I can see, although I just finished Rick Atkinson's book, his second volume about the Revolutionary War. And boy, that was a near miss, if ever there was one. So I've come away from that book thinking, well, things can get pretty dark in this country, and somehow we manage. But basically, what we're seeing is performance has replaced governance. And I think that's the most important thing to notice about what's happening today. Long established freedoms have been undermined, popular programs vandalized, scientific discovery trashed, and the economy disrupted. The main thing, though, is that the constitutional balance of powers has been upended and is far from what the framers intended. And so what you see then, we've seen many of these developments before, But there's an atmosphere of unease and fear in this country. It's probably the one thing that Americans agree on right now. And so I've been asking myself, okay, we've been in bad places before, really bad places in this country. Is this really different? And it seems to me that it is. That never have I seen or read about so many developments all happening all at once and not so blatantly lawless and transgressive as what we're seeing right now. So I think these fears are probably not misplaced, but they've also provided difficulties for me in developing this analysis for today. There are several factors going on here that I don't understand, and most people don't seem to understand them either. And so part of what I'm trying to do today is to make sense of why are some of these things occurring? Why, for example, is the level of public grievance, anger, and fear so intense when the state of the nation on paper looks pretty good? Why do decent, patriotic citizens, some of whom are in my family, tolerate the cruelty of places like Alligator, Alcatraz, and separation of immigrant children from their parents? Why does a significant minority in this country, predominantly Republicans, I'm sorry to say, reject democracy after so many generations, again, including members of my family, struggle to protect it? And finally, how do corporate titans feel about bending the knee to Trump, whose primary business experience has been a lot of bankruptcy? And how do they feel about having him dictate terms to their companies? The US government now has a share of the US Steel deal. A number of companies are now engaged in pay-to-play to get permits or approval for various things that they're doing. And most importantly, how do they address the chaotic decision-making, particularly about tariffs, that we see going on every day? So in a sense, why are we seeing this at a time when things are really not that bad? And you can partly tell that they're not that bad in some ways because business is going on as usual while all of this seems to be happening in Washington. There's a great paradox here that MAGA is attacking elite corruption, like the Epstein scandals, while ignoring the actual corruption that's occurring daily in the White House. Certainly, public trust is eroded badly and not without reason. And if you look at this slide, what you see, going back to 1960, public trust in the Eisenhower years, which is when we all came of age, or many of us, and it continued right through most of Johnson, although people used to say about Johnson, how do you know when he's lying? And the answer, of course, is when his lips start moving. But you see Nixon, I'm not used to this particular clicker, but you see that mistrust starts with Nixon. It's interesting, it plummets with Carter and bounces back a little bit, but nowhere near what it was. And then it's a steady downward slide to here. Public trust has never been lower since these statistics have been covered. So what I'm thinking about the scope and the durability of the MAGA movement, after all, it's been with us about 10 years now. It's never been a majority, and I think there are a couple of things going on. First of all, I think it can be traced to a backlash from the gradual changes in the domain of rights and freedoms that changed steadily, not during the New Deal, but with Lyndon Johnson's efforts to fulfill the New Deal and the steady expansion of those rights, really claimants making demands for particular rights today. In addition, you see the weakening of national political institutions. These are trends fed by events beyond our control in many ways. And these trends are, I think, aggravating, accentuating the kinds of dismay that is represented by this graph. You see, for example, a lot of crises that were beyond our control. 9/11, the financial crisis of 2018, the longest war in America's history, COVID, and of course the insurrection on January 6th in 2021, trying to overturn a presidential election. This is also occurring in the context of record income inequality. And when you go back to the late teens and 20s, you see another period of political unrest and violence. It was on the left then, the anarchists, the communists, the socialists, the share our wealth people, and whatever, and that, of course, was accentuated by the Great Depression. This time, the unrest is primarily on the right. But nevertheless, when you look at this inequality, you look at the hollowing out of rural communities. You look at all of the closed factories in the Rust Belt. You look at a lot of change that has been negative in some sort of aggregate sense, and it's happened so gradually that I think most of us didn't pay serious attention to it. The irony is that the Republicans, the self-described party of conservatives, which ordinarily is all about preserving tradition and norms and institutions, they're the ones blowing things up this time, not the left. And it's particularly ironic because these major crises actually happened on the watch of Republican presidents, and their dominant constituencies have benefited enormously from globalization and the economic havoc that brought to many parts of the United States. So when you look at the big picture, you begin to see, okay, I can see why some people are feeling left out and aggrieved. But again, the extremity of the reaction still continues to seem out of proportion to me. But I've been reminded about Ben Franklin's famous statement after he got a draft of the Constitution in Paris, where he was ambassador in 1787, and somebody asked him, well, what's the design of the Constitution? Is it a monarchy or a republic? And he said, well, madam, it's a republic if you can keep it. And I think that's where we are now. Can we keep this republic? And so what I want to talk to you about today is kind of give a better understanding of what some of the threats might be. And I think, since this is a talk about the four freedoms, we ought to go back and start with an understanding of what liberty means, what a free society, how the free society defines liberty. And so we'll do that first. Then I'm going to talk about some of the backlash and the forms that it has taken, because this is not new. The backlash we're seeing now with the abolition of DEI and the expunging of references to slavery and the Smithsonian, all of these kinds of things started much earlier in contemporary history. So we'll go back and look at some of the backlash. Then we'll talk about what I think is the second problem, not just the conflict created by the expansion of the domain of rights, but more importantly, the gradual and steady failure of institutions. For the first is Congress, which has lost so much capability. I know some of you think that it never had much, but it had a good deal more than most people understood, and it has a good deal less now than it should. There's also been a failure in the presidency, and it's a different kind of failure. Instead of losing power, the failure there in the presidency is the presidency has too much power. I remember the day after the 2016 election. I was teaching Introduction to American Politics. And I came into the room. We happened to be talking about the presidency on that day. My students were sitting in their chairs. They were crying. And I said to them, now you know why I've been lecturing about why the presidency is too powerful. Because it should never be the case that young people are crying over the result. And so we had some pretty good conversations after that. But that moment stayed with me. There was a sort of a desperate confusion. How could this possibly have happened? The other thing then, once we talk, in the Supreme Court, which has gone rogue in recent years. So we will then turn to a way forward. I changed the title because I think there may be more than one way forward, but this is the one that interests me and about which I think I have some expertise. So we're going to be flying at a pretty high altitude in this talk. Since we're in such a new situation, I don't have a lot of graphs to show you. I don't have a lot of statistics. I don't have a lot of evidence about what I want to suggest today. So we're going to be up high, and I want to stress the fact that this talk is highly speculative, and you can't come back to me in 6 months and say, but you said, and I'll say yes, but it was highly speculative. So here we go. The first thing is to talk about the meaning of freedom. I think the thing to stress, particularly given that 30% of people who say we should have an autocracy, we need a strong person, freedom is a luxury we can't afford today, I think the answer is, we can't afford to not have it. Free societies are peaceful domestically. Free societies are peaceful internationally. Democracies don't go to war with each other, which is why George W. Bush was so keen on promoting democracy around the world. He understood that the democratic peace was partly a function of the political systems that existed in the world. Free societies use resources more efficiently. Free societies are more innovative. I went to Russia as part of a US scholarly delegation. It was then the Soviet Union in the fall of 1987. It was extraordinary to see how an unfree society operated. And the thing that was sort of emblematic of my understanding was, I'm a tea drinker, and there were watchers on every floor. They were ostensibly there to help you and make you tea, but really they were spying on you. And so I went and asked for some tea, and the woman there, who was pretty unfriendly, made it for me. She heated up her electric samovar. She took the teapot. She put hot water into the teapot, which if you're a tea drinker, you know is a good way to make good tea. And then she dumped it on the floor. I was dumbfounded. And then she made me tea once she had very carefully warmed up the teapot. To me, that showed all of the reasons why you don't want to be in an authoritarian system, because people simply don't care about their job, they don't care about doing well, they just care about not getting into trouble. And so you have to recognize that when you give up freedom, you're giving up an efficient society. Let's not forget how much money and personnel it takes to oppress people. Look at the billions and billions of dollars being pumped into ICE right now. And that's because coercing people, controlling people, costs a lot of money. It needs prisons, it needs detention camps, it needs lots of people to round them up and then to watch them and so forth. It's an enormous drain on any economy. But it also interrupts innovation. Free societies are innovative. So for me, defending freedom is not just about I don't want to be subjected to illegal searches. I don't want police invading my home. Those are all true. But at an aggregate level, giving up freedom is really a bad thing to do in a society in terms of prosperity and progress. More importantly, you have to think about freedom as really paradoxical. Free societies don't work unless people know how to control themselves, and unless they adhere to certain basic behavioral norms about cooperation and about respect for others and about respect for the law. So the paradox is we can have freedom as long as we know how to control our own behavior up to some kind of standard. So, and that's the paradox. Free societies are cheaper, they're more innovative because they're not spending all this time and money on coercion. But if people can't regulate their own behavior and respect their fellow citizens, then eventually we will lose a free society. And that, of course, is what is so worrisome about the lack of respect for the rule of law, which is what we're seeing now. More importantly, I think you have to see that our ideas about freedom have changed, and rather dramatically. I've got some slides here. Okay, come on. Jean-Louis, help. There we go. Here's the first one. This is the traditional constitutional definition of freedom. Do you recognize this? It's a rattlesnake. Why is a rattlesnake a symbol of freedom? Because, according to Ben Franklin, who was the one who pioneered the use of this coil rattler before the Revolutionary War began, a rattler is somebody who keeps to himself and minds its own business, right? Until disturbed and threatened, in which case the rattler is quite deadly. So the idea was, don't tread on me, which is text that often goes with this rattler sign. And it basically is, if you interfere with my personal freedom, you're going to be sorry. And so when you begin to think about that notion of liberty, what you see is this is really about negative liberty, that people are free from the interference of government as they go about their daily lives. And that's why when you look at the liberties that are listed in the Bill of Rights, which of course was passed after the Constitution was adopted, in the Bill of Rights, these are all about the things that government cannot do to you as a citizen. There's nothing in those rights about freedom from want or freedom from fear, although there is a sense, very much so, of the importance of freedom of conscience and religion and freedom from detention and lack of due process with criminal justice and so forth. So this is the traditional kind of 18th century view in the United States of what freedom was all about. Here's a little different one, and this starts to take hold in the 70s and 80s, 60s. And it's really about, I should be free from you imposing spillover effects on me. I can't be free if you're polluting the air I breathe, if you're polluting the water I breathe, if you're building a noisy factory next to my farm that disturbs my chickens, and so forth. In this case, we begin to see how dealing with spillover effects from one person's use of freedom to another person's expectation of being free from harm comes into play. This, of course, is about gun control, which is a classic case where two legitimate freedoms are in conflict, where the NRA is promoting an absolute free use of firearms, including concealed ones, and firearms that have nothing to do with deer hunting and so forth. And of course, the widespread availability of guns in this country has prompted a major health emergency, the killing of our children in schools. So you could probably think about other kinds of examples where these clashes. A very important one is the conflict between freedom of conscience and religion and women's claims of autonomy over their bodies. If you know of a woman down the street from you who's getting an abortion and you think abortion is murder, then her behavior is requiring that you do something about that because your conscience tells you that that's murder. She doesn't happen to think it's murder. And you begin to see the kinds of clashes that are kicked up when the society starts to deal seriously with the spillovers from one person's behavior onto another, how that can create conflict. These are not negotiable. It's not like saying, are we going to spend $50 on textbooks or $100 on textbooks? Okay, we'll split the difference and we'll spend $75 on textbooks. So when you have these non-negotiable freedoms coming up against each other, you get a lot of aggrieved people. You get aggrieved people on both sides, right? This person is interfering, by being profligate with guns, is advocating things that are dangerous to my children. I'm afraid to send my daughter to school. And the NRA person saying, the Second Amendment says I have the right to bear arms. We can all disagree about the Second Amendment's language, but that's another story. So you can see in these spill effects with environmental policy, consumer protection, those are the big ones, but with privacy laws and all sorts of things, how things can begin to set up conflict. And then lastly, a 20th century version of freedom, which is not the freedom from government activity or freedom from spillovers, but freedom to fulfill one's own potential. This comes from philosophical discourse in the 20s, and it reflects a sense, if I'm starving in the dark, am I free to fulfill my potential? Am I free to do what my God-given talents should enable me to do? And this view of freedom is the basis, really, of what Franklin Roosevelt was driving at when he talks about freedom from want and freedom from fear. That is, you can't be free if you're ignorant in a society that values education. You can't be successful in school if you haven't had breakfast and you only get one meal a day at home. So this is a notion, if the coiled rattler symbolizes negative liberty, that is, government can't do things to you, this is the idea of positive liberty. And so you have the elderly couple complaining about the fact that if they buy their prescription drugs, they won't have any money, perhaps, to buy food. This one, of course, is college graduates going over the precipice because they're so heavily indebted and jobs are disappearing for their cohort. So when you take these norms of freedom, you begin to see how conflicts about freedom could be very, very problematic. So let's go back now to Mr. Roosevelt and think about what the four freedoms were. Freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech. When these were passed in the New Deal, this was primarily about the freedom of want, was primarily about empowering white working class men who were protected in their right to organize into labor unions, and programs like Social Security and aid to families with dependent children were intended to help the kind of deserving people in the society. White working class men, elderly, poor, and children who had poor parents. These programs were restricted by the Southern conservatives who were dominant in the legislature during the New Deal. And so the occupations that were covered were occupations where whites predominated. The occupations where blacks dominated: farm work, service work, house cleaning and housekeeping for women. Those were not covered. And one of the things that's happened with Social Security is a steady expansion of who gets covered by society. That is to say, who gets the freedom from want. It's also the case that Social Security had a kick-in point, if you all remember, of 65 at the time. The average life expectancy at that time was about 61. So the expectation was that most people would not live to collect their Social Security. Nevertheless, it was an important concept. And with the GI Bill and with Truman's desegregation of the military, you had beginnings of the expansion of a sense of positive liberty, empowering people. In this case with GIs, this was what some scholars have called a virtuous circle. These men and women put their lives on the line. They come back, the country ensures that they can develop their God-given talents. Now, unfortunately, because this was won through state and private educational institutions, very few blacks got the benefit of the GI Bill, and very few women did. But nevertheless, there was this sense of, okay, GIs deserve positive liberty because they've sacrificed for our country. But positive liberty has always been kind of contingent on this notion of deservingness. Along comes LBJ, a disciple of Franklin Roosevelt, and he signed civil rights legislation, a feat that probably his experience as one of the most effective Senate minority leaders ever seen, says that, okay, basic freedoms, like voting, will now be guaranteed to everybody. And that basically the war on poverty was the very specific manifestation of positive freedom. That if you could go to a Head Start program as a little child, you had a better chance of staying out of jail as a teenager and a better chance of getting a decent job as an adult. Then you have, interestingly, Mr. Nixon, who in many ways expanded the idea of freedom from spillovers. I think most of you don't remember, but when I worked in Washington in 69 and 70, Nixon was responsible for creating the EPA. He presided over the adoption of consumer protection legislation. It was because he hadn't actually won the popular vote in 1968, and he was courting the middle class that was very worried about the quality of life being impeded by these spillover effects. Carter, too, addressed spillover effects. The second kind of freedom: everybody deserves to do their individual thing as long as they don't harm others, okay? And then you get the rights revolution in the Supreme Court, the Warren and Burger courts, that applied the 14th Amendment of due process to state governments, and that expanded the domain of privacy and other sorts of personal rights. And then, of course, you had the evolution of personal and social norms about how you could behave in a more permissive society about family and sexual mores. So, naturally, when you begin to think about all of these different conflicts, you're going to get a backlash. And I love this cartoon. Any rate, so the backlash starts to come as new claimants say, wait a minute, those guys won rights by going to the Supreme Court, we're going to do that too. And pretty soon conservatives said, wait a minute, they've been so successful with that, we're going to start litigating to start taking away some of those rights. And of course, there was a well-funded movement of conservative think tanks and legal foundation and legal organizations that began to try to roll back some of these in the courts. At any rate, I think these grievances about rights conflict and changing norms ripened under technological and global change because people became less certain about what they thought they knew and what was ahead of them in the future. And you see the hollowing out of rural areas, of manufacturing areas, and the loss of opportunity for college graduates, captured most dramatically, I think, with an enormous increase in deaths of despair, which has been well documented by economists, of men, white men in their which should be their highest earning years, basically just tossing in the towel, and now, of course, suicide among very young people. And then we have constant war going on. I don't think people, actually I'm going to go back for that for a minute. I don't think people really took seriously the warning of a Nobel Prize winning economist who said that the price tag for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were going to be enormous in terms of human suffering and in terms of cost. His estimate was $3 trillion. But basically, we never paid that bill. We partly didn't pay it because we didn't raise taxes, which is typically what you do when you're in an expensive war. And we didn't pay it because we didn't take care of the people who had fought in that war. And many of them are now in the MAGA movement because they feel betrayed by what happened. So when you have a society on a wartime footing for 20 years, it pollutes everything, I think. People's sense of themselves and sacrifice. But you begin to see the beginning of the backlash happening here. It's important to understand that it really starts with Reagan. He was the one who campaigned very overtly on deregulating the economy and on reducing the cost of the social welfare state. He didn't succeed with either of those. And his failures, despite his personal charm, his popularity with the public, his electoral landslides, was very frustrating to conservatives. They felt that Reagan should be allowed to be Reagan, and the villain in their heads was the Democratic-controlled Congress. So they developed, and a lot of the people who are serving in public life now developed those expectations in the Reagan years, and they were coupled with the Bush years, where Bush was valiantly trying to save the world from terrorism, and Congress was an impediment rather than a partner in that view. So you get also an effort to return responsibilities to the states. The Rehnquist court was big on federalism, and you also find efforts to roll back the rights revolution, freedom from harm and freedom to attain one's personal in the Supreme Court. These doctrines of originalism and textualism are just pretext in my view, because I can find no basis for them in the Constitution or in the writings of the Federalist Papers. And several of you who've studied the Federalist Papers with me in Osher classes understand, where I'm coming from, and we could perhaps spend more time on that in the discussion. But basically, textualism says you can't interpret the Constitution beyond what the literal words on the page mean. That's true for the Constitution. There's no right of privacy, therefore abortion is not a protected process. And if the statute says you can, this applies to one kind of behavior, you can't assume that a related behavior is also covered. So if the language isn't in the text, then the statute can't be applied except in this very literal sense. And this is what today's court is doing to dodge a lot of efforts by people to assert rights against the depredations of the Trump administration. Originalism is more problematic in my view. Originalism is basically the meaning of the Constitution was set in 1787 when it was ratified. Anything that's not in the Constitution is not protected. In other words, the document was set in amber 200 some odd years ago, and if it's not in the Constitution, then it's not protected. Now, what's interesting is the right of judicial review, a claim that the Supreme Court first made in 1803 with Marbury versus Madison, does not give the Supreme Court the power to declare legislation unconstitutional. It's an implied power, and it's implied because why have a written constitution if you're not going to interpret it? So almost 100 years of constitutional doctrine in which the Constitution was treated as a blueprint that allowed the country to adapt to changing social, political, economic circumstances has now been turned on its head. No, if they didn't think of it in 1787, it's not constitutional. There's a famous quote by Antonin Scalia, who's the architect of this way of thinking, that basically women do not have rights under the 14th Amendment because women were not mentioned in that language. So there you have it. So with this backlash, we start to see what is called participatory demonocracy, where the angry citizen points at something he or she doesn't like, diagnoses as a cost, it's immigrants, it's feminazis, it's absent fathers, it's whatever it's elites molesting children and so forth. They call a radio talk show host, they denounce loudly, and then they go on with their day knowing that they've taken care of things. But I think the more important thing is, in addition to this reaction against the rights revolution, you have to look at this kind of ambling disaster towards institutional failure in the national government. And as I say, it's not just Congress, although that's the worst one, but it's also the presidency and the Supreme Court, and I'll talk a little bit more soon. But basically, you have to understand the constitutional system is a separation of power system. It's fragmented by federalism. We have a bicameral legislature, which most democracies don't have, that has to both agree, and you have staggered electoral terms that lead to divided government. We have a fragmented party system that can't control of who bears its standard. We have parties are campaign organizations rather than governing organizations. And you have enormous dependence for elections on outside groups, PACs, and dark money. And to top that all off, you have a media that has been in decline. So, to go briefly, the decline in Congress. Post-World War II, Congress looked and said, wow, we gave a lot of power to the president. We're going to take it back. And they structured themselves in a way to do that by developing an independent autonomous committee system. But Newt Gingrich, after 1995, basically wanted to strengthen the presidency, wanted to centralize control in the party leadership, and he basically trashed the committee system with a loss of expertise, with a loss of authority, and with the inability. That's where all the bargaining took place, between the parties, was in committees. So when the committees became irrelevant, and that's what a lot of my research on foreign policy has focused on. Non-competitive elections. It's a scandal how many seats are not contested at the congressional level, and how much the primaries are dominated by a small number of extremists and big money. We have then a disappearance of moderates in both parties in Congress, which is where all the deals typically are supposed to be made. With Congress hamstrung, the political decisions are deflected to the president or the courts. And it's shocking to me, for example, that Congress couldn't even patch a budget resolution in the spring. Mind you, that's not binding. They still have to do the authorization and appropriations bills. They couldn't do it without Trump basically dictating the terms, which is probably appropriate because he dictated what the bill was going to have in it and over the objections of the members. What we have now, we don't have a system of checks and balances. We have a system of the presidency and the Supreme Court doing what they feel like it, secure in the knowledge that Congress is not going to be able to claw back things or prevent them from doing these things. In addition, you have the imperial presidency. Oh, here we go. This is how we get performance politics rather than substantive politics in Congress. In this case, the tagline is, now that we've done nothing relevant, so let's find a scapegoat. In this case, gay marriage, and distract people from the effect that we're not doing anything. When you think about the presidency, you're really talking about Woodrow Wilson's ideal of the presidencies being the most legitimate office because it's the only one with a national constituency, and the idea that we should have professional administration in the executive branch rather than party hacks. We are now seeing, of course, that the presidency is not a symbol of national unity, and that we are going back to a government being administered by party hacks. Since the Cold War, Congress has basically delegated more and more authority to the president. And divided government, this is the key takeaway from this, divided government puts enormous pressure on the president to act. So you have Obama, for example, issuing an executive order to protect the Dreamers. You have Joe Biden, couldn't get relief for indebted students, so he issues an executive order. In this case, both of those actions were struck down by the Supreme Court as exceeding executive authority. What a difference a decade makes. So now, unfortunately, presidents are no longer unifiers. So we've seen the disappearance. Presidents don't get a honeymoon anymore. They're leaving office with record low levels of popularity. They are basically, because they've accrued so much power, they're blamed for everything. The idea of blaming Joe Biden for the price of eggs when there was a bird flu epidemic destroying chickens all around the country is ludicrous. But it tells you, it's instructive of how much presidents have both gained in terms of power, but also becoming responsible for everything. And that's not a healthy situation. Then you get to the partisan Supreme Court. The court, of course, constitutionally is the weakest branch. As Hamilton wrote, it has neither sword nor purse. And so the court historically has relied on restraint. And the restraints, it waits for cases to come on appeal and decides if they're ripe now, which usually means there are lots of conflicting circuit court decisions that require them to weigh in. They rely on precedent through stare decisis. They decide cases normally. They never make them more expansive than ever. This was what was so shocking about the Trump immunity case. They not only made a ruling about this particular case, they should have done it narrowly. They didn't. Instead, they basically said, as long as the president is acting in his role as president, he can't be prosecuted. So they gratuitously extended more power to the president than even he had claimed. And they have to defend their decisions with written opinions. We see the courts typically, historically, have been deferential to the executive branch, and also that they've tended to favor property rights and business over time. So we're now realizing, I think, that that expansion, that rights agenda of the Warren and Burger courts was an anomaly. And people made the mistake of assuming that the Supreme Court would always be the protector of individual rights, when they actually have not much of a track record of doing that. The politicization of nominations starts with Nixon, but it's in full flower. People who study voting in our decisions in courts have now determined that the least political, the least partisan courts are the federal district courts. Next, a little more partisan, ideological, the circuit courts, and the Supreme Court is now almost exclusively partisan. You can tell how these members are going to vote by the party of the president that appointed them. So much for the legitimacy of the court. And then their use of textualism and originalism is not a doctrine that's accepted anywhere outside of the Federalist Society. This has not been embraced by legal scholars or by practicing attorneys. The exception, of course, this was a Bush case. So back when Bush was claiming all sorts of powers over terrorists imprisoned in Guantanamo, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. The Constitution does not give the president a blank check. But the current court is in a very different place. It is giving the president a blank check. And the worst part of it is this use of the shadow docket. Lots of opinions being decided now to favor the president that have not had a hearing. There haven't been arguments in front of the judges, and there's no written opinion. So this is kind of a bleak picture of rights fostering conflict in a time when our political institutions that are supposed to be resolving conflict are dysfunctional, all of them. I see some hope in the fact that, for the most part, Americans agree about more than they disagree. There are large majorities who still say the US is the greatest country in the world, who agree, despite their party, that the US system needs overhaul. There are large majorities that agree on big problems like inflation, taxes on the wealthy, healthcare affordability, housing needs, the need for the parties to work together, immigration reform, gun control, reproductive rights, increasing Medicare, Social Security, and benefits for veterans. Somebody did a study and identified in 2024, there were 109 different policy proposals that commanded substantial majorities from both parties. So I look at these data and I say, there's a lot we still agree on in this country. 67% believe it is very important for the president to unite the country. 90% believe that the president should be honest. So I think about this, and I remember, I think it was Winston Churchill who said this in the context of World War II. And he said to his advisors, Americans do the right thing, but only after they've tried everything else. And so I think, okay, there's a lot here to build on if we could figure out how to do it. So here's where, but there are also a lot of constraints. All major US institutions, the church, business, the police, except for the US military, have lost legitimacy in the eyes of the public. The Supreme Court is at its lowest level of approval ever. So is Trump's has the lowest approval in this point in a term of any president. Congress, of course, is always perennially low in approval. And interestingly enough, since Donald Trump has been operating, Congress is actually, its approval's gone up. It's up to 23%, still well below these other institutions. What's troubling about these approval numbers is huge gaps between Democrats and Republicans. 64% difference in approval about the Supreme Court, for example. There are no Democrats who approve of what the Supreme Court is doing, statistically trivial. A lot of Republicans think this is just fine. So given these big gaps in approval in all of these different branches, there's no incentive for the Republicans to change what they're doing or to thwart Donald Trump in his course of action. And I think what that means is that the 2026 election that everybody is so desperately looking to change the course of things, I don't think it's going to do that. I think for one reason, if the Democrats can't contest more seats than they seem to be planning to, if you just focus on the 18 toss-up states, that's not going to give you the kind of repudiation of MAGA-ism that many people hope for. I think they underestimate the effects of the kind of voter suppression that's going on across the states in off-year elections, which are really hard at any time to mobilize people. Although right now, the Democrats do have a significant enthusiasm advantage over Republicans. You have to accept the fact that the Democratic label is toxic in many parts of the country, which is why some of the best candidates who came close to winning in red states were running as independents. It's also the case that, unlike the Watergate election, were the Democrats to be successful in retaking the House and maybe the Senate, I don't see any sense that they have the kind of reform agenda that was present in 1974 after the blowout Watergate election. So people want to reform things, but where are these ideas? Where are the leaders in Congress who are going to implement them? It's a very, very different situation, and I know something about this because the 74 election and candidate recruitment was the topic of my PhD thesis. So what this means is, if I'm right, that the constraints are pretty serious on improving things in Congress, then the other two branches will continue to run amok. And so here I am back to what I said I wanted to get away from, that things can't get better until they get worse. And I think there's still something to that, but I do have a couple of things. I would prioritize congressional reform and get Madison's, this is James Madison, by the way, walking a tightrope, and go back to the idea that Congress is the most powerful branch under the Constitution. If it doesn't work, the rest of it can't work. And so I would focus on Congress, and I would focus on rebuilding the candidate pool. You can't beat somebody with nobody. And the major argument in my first book was, who wins depends on who runs. So there has to be a lot more effort to build potential candidates in local and state government and to identify people who might carry a message of preserving democracy. If all they do is see that all the parties' resources are focused on these 18 seats and they're going to be out there on their own with no support, they're not going to run. And you're not going to get the 74 Watergate election, despite the conditions in the country. Oops, here we go back. It's also the case that I think, and I've written a lot about this, we need to restructure the incentives inside the institution to promote members' investment in congressional committees, to develop expertise, to spend the hard work of learning about each other's perspectives. After all, Madison writes in Federalist 10, the purpose of the Congress and the members there is to refine and enlarge the public view. And they do that by talking to each other, by sitting in a room with witnesses and figuring out what the facts really are. The mechanisms for doing that and that fundamental Federalist 10 responsibility have atrophied badly. And Congress needs to revive the committee system. and decentralize the party leadership. As the idea of centralizing control in party leaders was to make Congress more efficient so it could enact legislation. As the party leaders have gotten more and more control, we have more and more times where we're missing budget deadlines, government shutdowns, operating with continuing resolutions, and being unable to address even the most basic things. We've had multiple presidents, W, Obama, and Biden, who wanted legislation to reform the immigration system. They couldn't get it. So you need to rescind the war authorizations and the emergency powers that have been enacted. I think there's something like 56 emergency declarations covering all sorts of things. And we're seeing how the one dealing with tariffs is being misused by this president. And we need to lengthen the work week and raise the pay and demand more of our lawmakers than has been the case. I also think when I was in graduate school, federalism was kind of a bad thing because federalism was associated with Jim Crow in the South. But we're seeing now the states have a lot of power. Governors command significant resources and national attention. Attorneys general are engaging in some very significant litigation. So rather than a barrier to promoting freedom in this context, it looks like the states are one of the major contestants in this battle for liberty. It's also the case that state constitutions typically contain more of the kind of freedom from spillover and freedom from want kinds of protections than the federal constitution does. It's also the case that state and local governments are the place where we train people to become candidates, and states, of course, control elections. My own view is that without stable career ladders, we're not going to get the kinds of politicians that Madison talked about. The term he used, the masters of the public business. He said, not every lawmaker has to be a statesperson, but we need a critical mass of those people in the legislature. And the way they learn how to do it is by serving in local and state legislatures. So when somebody like J.D. Vance says, you know, he never ran for anything, he's never served in a legislature, I say, oh boy, what a qualification for not getting this job. And of course, he didn't accomplish anything in the Senate in his brief time there. And you see that over and over. When politicians are boasting about the fact that they don't know anything about government, that seems to me to be antithetical to everything that the framers understood was important. So in conclusion, typically when we get reform in the United States, it's because of a big bang election. 1932, 1974, 1946, actually, which is one the Republicans won, where you get a compelling majority that repudiates the incumbent administration and forces them to take a hard look at themselves. After the Republicans lost the White House in 2012, I was on a panel at Rocky where the Republicans talked about the fact that they had had a kind of a come-to-Jesus election and that they had to take a look at the divisive politics and what the Freedom Caucus and the Tea Party people were doing to the party. And they wrote a report and whatever, but then, of course, they never implemented it because Donald Trump came along and he thrived on the kind of politics that Republicans thought had been repudiated in 2012. At any rate, it appears, though, that given what I've talked about, the constraints, we're a long way from that kind of a realigning election. And as long as Republicans continue to poll favorably towards Trump, it's around 60%. So even though you see lots of graphs showing Trump's approval declining, that's all among Democrats who never approved him. It's really independents who are sending that message. Independents are less likely to vote in off-year elections, by the way, than partisans. And so while there's 60% there, and that's what I really mean when I say things have to get worse before they get better, they have to get worse for the president. And finally, until that changes, I don't see much incentive for GOP officials and business elites to repudiate what he's doing. H.L. Mencken, who was a well-known cynical humorist in the last century, once said, "Americans want democracy, and they deserve it to get it good and hard." And given the obstacles to change that seem to my political scientist to be quite problematic, it seems likely that we'll continue to get it good and hard for some time. Thank you for coming. Okay.
Thank you, Linda.
My
You've given
pleasure.
us quite a task.
Well, I said we were flying high today. Do you have some remarks you want to make now?
Yes, yes. We're going to take a 30-minute break. There'll be cookies and coffee downstairs. Why don't we come back here at 10:40, and that'll be for the question and answer session. Write your questions down here, those of you in the Opera House here. There are cards up front, there are cards up back, and put them in the basket, please, both here in the back. And a couple of us are going to go through all that and select the questions, as well as those coming from the people who are online. So be back here, please, at 10:40. Thank you. Well, with all the questions you received, I think we're going to be here for another 2 hours.
Maybe he is, but I'm not.
Let me start with one that is going to lead us to another,
Okay.
immediately related. Historically, has there ever been a time when all three branches of the government were so low and rated so low in public opinion?
Probably, if we were keeping track of some of the governments before Gallup was running these polls. Remember, this polling data is fairly old, it's fairly recent. So I don't know what the Harding administration, for example, would look like, or some groups like, can you hear me? Yeah, oh, okay. But I would say my personal view is I worked on Capitol Hill in 69 and 70. I worked for a congressman, a Democrat from Baltimore County, and that was pretty low. Remember the city, the mid-60s were with the urban riots where most of America's major cities were burning. You could see the fires from the Capitol, by the way. And for me, one of my jobs was to write condolence letters from the list of casualties that was dropped off on my desk every day by a colonel. And some days the book was this high. That was a period when Congress refused to take a stand. They never had a roll call vote on their support for the Vietnam War, and basically let first Johnson and then Nixon do whatever he thought was best with respect to the war. So that was a time when approval was pretty low. The exception, what's different about this time, the Supreme Court has never been in this kind of loss of legitimacy. That's the big difference. The court in the past, its use of judicial restraint has protected it from the Sturm and Drang of ordinary party politics. But now, their full-throated engagement is really cost them dearly. And it's really a shame because John Roberts, the Chief Justice, is supposed to be an institutionalist, and that his primary concern has been to protect the reputation and legitimacy of the court. And he's failed miserably and will be known historically as a failed Chief Justice. The Roberts Court is not going to be regarded as a distinguished court at all. So that would, I think, would be the difference. So the answer, I guess, is no. We've never had this before because the difference is with the court sinking so low. They're usually around 60%.
One of your books talks about the responsibility of the Congress in terms of oversight over foreign policy. Why has that eroded so much? That is a key part of our system of checks and balances, the Congress of the United States. And it doesn't seem to be doing its job.
Well, there are a couple of things going on, but the big one is when Gingrich emasculated committee chairs and diverted resources from the committee system, they lost staff, they lost prestige, they lost autonomy, and the members on these committees, which have bipartisan memberships, were basically instructed, don't have anything to do with those Democrats. It was interesting. I used to be a consultant for the Library of Congress that would run information sessions for new members. And after the Gingrich Congress, they stopped happening. So members of both parties, along with their spouses, used to go down on the train together to Williamsburg and see a reenactment, talk to key officials in the government, but mostly they learned about each other, what their shared experiences were in electioneering and whatever. That all came to an end with Gingrich, and of course now most members don't bring their families to Washington. I was talking with someone at dinner last night who said the school she went to, there were children of Congress people there. That doesn't happen anymore. And so the opportunities for members to engage with each other is a function of a lot of different things. But the bottom line is I think that there's the institutional mechanism for them to come together, the committees, is moribund. And that is a graph I could give you. The number of hearing days, the number of days per hearing, the length of sessions, the graphs are in the tank. There's almost no serious committee work going on. And when you have oversight hearings, you get that stupid one about Benghazi that went on for days, and they kept asking Hillary Clinton the same questions. And the whole idea was to tarnish her so she couldn't be an effective presidential candidate. It worked. It made her seem, even though she acquitted herself very well. But hearings now are all just about scoring points rather than gathering information for the members, so that they are very busy and they need to take their cues from somebody. And now the only cues are the president and the party leaders. They're not able to make up their own minds.
Directly related to that is questions, and I'll give you three of them here. Shouldn't we, in looking at the restoration of a Congress, require repeal of Citizens United, elimination of the Electoral College, and fix the Voting Rights Amendment? Take your choice.
Well, I'll take the easy one, which is the Electoral College, because there is a movement afoot that you can override the Electoral College without amending the Constitution. So that makes it the easiest. And almost enough democratic states have adopted this model statute that basically says the Electoral College votes of our state will go to the candidate who has the highest popular vote. And so basically, the Electoral College ceases to be a discretionary or meaningful body. I think they're shy about 60 Electoral College votes, and that's a possibility. So what are the other two?
Well, one relates directly to the
Citizen
tweaking of a Voting Rights Act.
Right. The Voting Rights Act, well, there really were two. There was the Voting Rights Act that established protections for Black voters, but there also was a Civil Rights Act that was enacted shortly thereafter. But the Voting Rights Act had this very controversial provision now that, as it was implemented, that districts should allow for majority-minority districts. That is to say, districting plans, in order to promote the goal of representation for Black voters, should allow Blacks to be in districts where they would constitute a majority of voters. Remember, this was back in the 60s. That was at a time when people didn't think whites would vote for Black candidates. And of course, Obama put paid to that one. It's also the case that these had to be majority-minority districts because Black voters had lower participation than white voters. That's also no longer true. And now these majority-minority districts are being used to pack Black voters and waste their votes. So if they're all packed in one district that elects a Black legislator, they're not available for a liberal Democrat to come along and appeal politically to a mixed coalition. And I've actually written a paper with my son, who's a geographer, about how these majority-minority districts are failing. And of course, now I think we're about to see this court say they're no longer constitutional, reversing a lot of years of precedent. John Roberts, I know, feels that any kind of discrimination under the Constitution, whether it's to favor a group or hinder a group, should enjoy the same status under the Constitution. So I think the legislation is pretty much done. Mm-hmm. You know, first they got rid of preclearance, and they got rid of some other things, and they said party gerrymandering was okay, which means Blacks are vulnerable because they're disproportionately Democratic and and they live in segregated neighborhoods, so they're easily identifiable to be packed or cracked in order to diminish their political power. In the end, since most of these majority black districts have produced some very distinguished members of Congress, but also some hacks, they're uncompetitive. I think blacks deserve competitive districts just like I think everybody does. And so I have mixed feelings about whether it's time to move beyond some of these restrictive provisions and whether it might be healthy in the long run for blacks to have to engage in coalition building. The other part of me says, look what they're doing in Alabama and Mississippi and whatever, we'll be back to Jim Crow before you know it. So I'm very ambivalent right now about the Voting Rights Act.
Another huge issue is the Citizens United, the money in politics.
Yeah. So in some places, we don't have enough money in politics. Look at all the districts that are uncontested. Look at all the districts that have weak challengers, people who've never run for office before, who are not taken seriously by the press or by the voters. Those districts need more money so that those candidates can be competitive. And that would be true in Republican-leaning districts as well as Democratic-leaning districts. The problem, of course, is that the dark money, the big PACs, both labor PACs and corporate PACs, are now able to engage in direct contributions. Until the Citizens United case, you were forbidden. Your PAC contributions were restricted to $2,500 for the primary and $25 for a general. That wasn't money I worried about that much. But now, when you have Thiel giving $35 million to J.D. Vance to rescue his failing Senate campaign in Ohio, when you have Elon Musk dumping $250 million into the presidential race in the August before the election, when Trump was behind Kamala Harris in the polls, that gets my attention. And I now think that maybe Will Rogers had it like that we have the best politicians money can buy. Although it turns out that a lot of these folks really don't inspire much confidence in me. So maybe they're not the best money could buy. Maybe they're selling something else.
There was a time when we were really trying to get to changing the way we fund elections and doing it out of a huge federal fund distributed in some economic way among the various people running. Is that dead forever?
It is for now. We'll see. These things, there's no idea that doesn't get trotted out again. To me, the objection I used to convey to my students about big pots of federal money to fund elections was that if we didn't change the recruitment process and the primary process, a lot of taxpayer money was going to go to fund the candidacies of wackos. And I wasn't keen on that. And so if the parties had better control over who carried their banner, and if there were better just better nominees. Right now with first past the post elections, in a 5-candidate primary race, who's going to get the most votes? The person with 33%. They can easily be J.D. Vance. And so unless we can solve these problems of first past the post elections and uncompetitive primaries and whatever, I worry that a lot of this money is going to be wasted and will actually could make things worse in some parts of the country. Now, the counter-argument is if solid people, good candidates with experience knew they had access to serious money, they might be willing to step forward and put themselves in the first past the post primary. But primaries themselves are just really problematic in terms of advantaging extremists in our society. And I would point out that we never chose congressional candidates with primaries until the 1980s. So this is a fairly recent problem. If you asked me, not for quotation, would you like to bring back the smoke-filled rooms? I would say yes.
Directly related again, there are two questions. Is the two-party system the problem, and what about ranked choice voting?
That's in my paper with my son. One of the things that we argue is what we need are larger congressional districts that have multi-members in them and a system of ranked choice voting. And what that means is if you have a big district with, say, 3 members in it, instead of 3 smaller districts, it's harder to gerrymander those districts. The reason why gerrymandering is so easy in this country right now is we have so much self-selection with housing. It's really hard. Pennsylvania is a case in point. Pennsylvania is a purple state. The presidential vote splits consistently almost 50-50. So do the statewide offices, except for this last governor's race and the Senate races. But the state legislature is highly skewed towards Republicans, or has been because of gerrymandering, and so were the congressional districts. It turns out the courts were only able to get more Democratic people elected by reverse gerrymandering because of these racial segregation, certainly in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and also income segregation. There has been a huge movement of self-selected segregating by class and income, not just race, and now it's by party. So the only way to combat that, in my view, is with bigger districts, which make it harder to draw homogeneous districts. There's a simple principle in geography, I'm told by my son. The bigger the scale, the more heterogeneous the constituency. So our logic is, three-member districts is about right, and we have the data to prove it in terms of more competition and whatever. But what was the second part?
Ranked choice voting.
Ranked choice voting. That's being used in Alaska. It was used in New York City. What it does is it deals with some of the problem of first past the post elections that I already talked about, that with ranked choice voting, the winner has to have a majority. And you get that by seeing, okay, which candidates have the most the first choice of more candidates, and which candidates are the second choice of voters if they don't get their first choice. And you go down the line and you gradually eliminate people who aren't anybody's second choice, who aren't anybody's third choice, and until you get a majority. So what that means is candidates, instead of just paying attention to their little 30% of extremists in their party, which is what we have now because of segregated, residentially homogeneous states, they have to pay attention to the second choice and the third choice, which means they have to have broader coalitions. And they can't just talk to the Tea Party or talk to people who are too far left. So if you combine our districting plan with ranked choice voting, you go a long way to reducing the incentives for candidates to polarize and for interest groups to dominate our selection. And so if you have candidates that are more appealing to a broader range of people in Congress, the turnout's going to go up, particularly in off-year elections, where now it's only about 38%. So I was reluctant. I thought it was a gimmick. And Chris finally persuaded me with maps that this was the way to go. Okay.
There seem to be a number of concerns about a conflict between capitalism and democracy. Isn't that a two-way street?
Oh, absolutely. I don't know which way the causal arrows go. Certainly the history of Europe suggests that expanding political participation went hand in hand with developing capitalism. And that was because the king needed the support not just of the nobles, but wealthy merchants in order to fight all of his wars and take care of all of his wives or whatever. So you could say that capitalism led to democratization, but you could also say the opposite. I think what you already know from what I said earlier in this lecture, that if you don't have a democratic society, if you don't have a free society, you're not going to be able to innovate, and you're going to be wasting so much in the way of resources on oppressing the people who don't agree with you. So, and in truth, you end up with what you have in Russia, which is crony capitalism, where oligarchs pay to play, and when they're in disfavor, they lose their companies and they end up in the gulag. That doesn't seem to me to be the kind of capitalism that is productive, innovative, and rewards people for effort.
Do you think a corporation is a person?
No. Maybe I would just say a corporation can't have a baby, so maybe we leave it at that. But that has been something that the Supreme Court more generally has been giving. So incorporation was a way of allowing companies to more efficiently allocate their resources and to encourage risk-taking on the part of investors who would not be liable if the company didn't do well, if they stuck with buggy whips when everybody was doing something else. But increasingly, corporations, first they got standing in the courts for torts and whatever, and now they have political speech rights because of the abolition of campaign spending, and there are a couple of other rights that they're getting, and I'm very much opposed to it.
What would de Tocqueville say if he came back today?
Okay. So Alexis de Tocqueville was the 1830s nobleman who traveled in the United States with a sidekick to see why democracy had survived in the United States when it had failed so miserably in France after the French Revolution. And he toured all around. He wrote a 2-volume study called Democracy in America, and some of us in Osher studied this together a couple of years ago. Tocqueville was very suspicious of equality because he felt that you had to have, that truly aristocratic societies would provide, it's an Aristotelian notion really, would provide people with the leisure to acquire the learning, to engage in the discussion and deliberation that would lead to good governmental decisions. So he was innately suspicious of democracy because it was a leveler. And people who were not educated, who were not interested in deliberation, could become decision makers. Although we had to admit that the aristocracy in France had not done a very good job of showing the virtues of democracy. When he comes to the United States, he notices this remarkable individualism that, and he coins that term, by the way, about Americans having no sense of past and no sense of history. And he said this was the Achilles heel of our experiment, that when people lost sight of where they came from and what their offspring were heading to, they would become what he called locked up in the isolation of their own hearts. That regime, he thought, would be very vulnerable to the vices and the mistrust of democracy. And he looked and he said, okay, how do Americans deal with this isolating phenomenon of individualism where they can't think about anybody's interest but their own, and they think their success is just a result of their own efforts? Remember that famous remark Obama made that caused so much controversy? He visited a plant and he said, "You didn't build this." And everybody went, "Whoa, what's he saying?" And what he said is, the people who built the schools who educated who educated your workers, who paid the taxes to pay the police to keep your factory safe from vandalism. Everybody built this factory. You've made wonderful decisions and you're entitled to all the success you want, but this was not your work alone. You're not solely responsible for it. So Tocqueville says, how does America seem to avoid this trap of individualism? And his answer was, they practice, here we go, self-interest rightly understood. They're understanding that inevitably their own personal interest required dependence on other people to organize politically, that you couldn't build a road just by yourself. In France they could, because they'd go to the great noble and say, we need a road, and he'd say, here's your road, or he'd say, you don't get a road. In the United States, if you wanted a road, you have to organize, and you had to go. So your self-interest becomes identified with a collective good. And that's why when Robert Putnam wrote his book, Bowling Alone, it set off alarm bells among political scientists, and that came out in 2000, I think, that Americans were foregoing what Tocqueville called the art of association, and with it, individualism would prevail. And of course, that's what we're seeing now.
We hear almost nothing these days about the common good, yet that's one of the critical concepts for the preservation of a democracy, isn't it?
There's certainly some understanding that, what is it that, when they were drafting the Declaration of Independence, if we don't hang together, we'll all hang separately, as they were signing it. As a woman, I've always been suspicious of appeals to the common good, because women are always being asked to do things for the common good that are contrary to their own interests. And we're seeing that now, where people are saying, go out, leave the workforce and go have more babies because we have a population crisis, or those kinds of things. So that doesn't mean I don't believe there is such a thing as the common good, but I have seen over and over and over again how common appeals to the common good are used to silence people. The most famous one probably is the well-meaning people who wrote Martin Luther King when he was in the Birmingham jail and said, you're disrupting the peace. The common good, the society is becoming disorderly and violent because of your protest activities. And they appealed to his sense of the common good, that he should dial back the civil rights movement because it was becoming disruptive of the common good. And his reply was, we've waited 100 years. How much longer do we need to preserve the common good for everybody else at our own expense? So that's the risk of it. How do we maintain some sense of community and commonality without using it to silence people whose views are unpopular?
For those of us who believe that our democracy is in for a more bumpy ride, as you have suggested, what do we do? Do we get out there and be relentless in speaking out persistently, loudly, and often?
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. So for me, being as partisan as I was at that podium is a very costly thing for me to have done. I've prided myself for a lot, more than half a century, of being able to say, to observe professional neutrality, particularly in my classes. If I had something good to say about a Democratic president, I would come up with a Republican one that I could say something positive in another way. In other words, I really embrace the idea of neutrality that our news media are trying so pitifully to try to observe. But for me, January 6th was to sort of say, you can't be neutral when the Capitol, where you used to give tours, is being desecrated with feces smeared on the wall, and the guards being, that I used to say hello to in the morning and whatever, being beaten with bike racks and whatever. So no more neutrality for you, Linda. So you speak out. The hardest thing is when you're in a situation where somebody says something and you know it's wrong and you don't want to be impolite. So you let it go. So that's my first thing that I do. I don't let it go anymore. The second thing I do is I've cut out people whose beliefs seem to me to be so detrimental to the common good. I should be talking to them, but right now I don't have the strength for that. I write letters to the editor, and I go out with Deb Nelson on Friday afternoons with my sign and attend demonstrations, but that's not enough. I'm also paying a lot of attention to this candidate recruitment season about who's coming forward. And when I see somebody that looks like they've got a good background and they want to run and it's an independent in Missouri, I'm on it. So that's where I am so far. I think as things get worse, there'll be more people, and I'll do more of that. It feels pretty small, though, doesn't it, given the scope of what I was outlining from 30,000 feet. Part of me, I've been waiting to see if the courts would hold. So far, they have. I think in the long run, what we're going to have to do is what they did in Romania and Hungary and Ukraine when they threw out the dictators, which was general strikes and widespread civil disobedience. But we're not there yet.
It seems to me that, I'm afraid I sort of believe that what you're talking about is going to get worse. It may well get worse. But there are a lot of people who are being distinctly hurt by the legislation that has been passed, particularly the economic legislation. And I'm inclined to think that as they feel more of the impact of this, they're going to vote differently.
Well, it's too bad because it's the 2026 election. What do we know about off-year elections? Low information, low income voters are the ones who don't show up, and they're the ones that need to happen. And what I want to see is local political parties getting people registered now, not in November of 2026. I want to see consistent messaging coming out. These things are going to hurt you. Now, some of the things that are going to hurt the most have been postponed very cleverly until 2027. So it's going to be hard to point to things. So I think we have to prepare to make sure that the off-year election isn't going to be a typical low turnout election. And that requires the parties to behave differently. I'm hoping that in some parts, in some red states, that members of Congress, instead of worrying about primary challenges from the right, which has been their problem all along, are going to get primary challenges for the left. And to me, that's what people like the Lincoln Project and whatever, that's what they should be doing, is going into those districts and finding right of center, people who are center right, to challenge some of these lawmakers on the basis of their votes for the big ugly and other kinds of things. They've now voted. They now have a record. And I think a big change would be to see primary challenges coming from the right, not coming from the right and the Republican Party. So what else was, there was one other thing I wanted to say. I can't remember what it was.
No, I was talking about that the number of voters are being hurt by the bills that have been passed, and won't that change their attitudes?
Well, as I say, some of that's been postponed. In many ways, the hurt that these workers, that particularly workers are going to feel, is not directly traceable to the president. They have to make causal connections. Tariff. Parts go up in my auto assembly plant. My company can't compete I'm going to be laid off. And that requires somebody to establish what that causal link is. When women with problematic pregnancies are fighting for their lives with a miscarriage, nobody's making the connection between appointing Barrett to the Supreme Court. But and so the hospital can't treat her pregnancy while the fetus still has a heartbeat. Those connections have to be made for a lot of these harms to be visible for people and for them to trace it to the right place. And in the past, we've relied on news media to do a lot of that tracing for us, and they're just not up to the job.
It seems to me that if we don't make some changes which directly affect the balance of powers that is inherent in the Constitution in the next interim election, we're in for deep, deep trouble, far deeper than we can imagine.
Well, I know, Bill, you have the expertise in foreign affairs that I don't have, because mine is primarily an institutional understanding. But you don't have to have 40 years of experience in national security policy to think it's probably not a good idea to antagonize your friends. It's probably not a good idea to change your policy every day by tweet. It's probably not a good idea to appoint party hacks to sensitive diplomatic posts. It's probably not a good idea to leave ambassadorships empty, and so forth. So maybe we'll get lucky. Because maybe there are enough people out in the world who'll say, Americans always do the wrong thing until eventually they figure it out. And then the resources and the capabilities in this country are unmatchable. But I sure would want to get back to that point where people are making those kinds of calculations.
Have the protests and demonstrations that have gone on thus far, the No Kings and so forth, are they effective? Should there be more?
Well, they're not going to change Trump's behavior. They're not going to turn Stephen Miller into somebody who has a heart. They're not going to give J.D. What's his name? Hegseth a brain. The audience for those protests are prospective candidates, people who are wondering, okay, this is a safe Republican seat. This may be the only time since I've always wanted to run for Congress that I can do it. That was a calculation that people made in the 1974 election. A lot of people said, I've always wanted to do this. If not now, then probably never. So a big audience, in my view, is for the prospective candidates that we need to run to make sure that all of these uncontested seats are contested and that they're contested by people who are taken seriously. The second audience are the sitting members of Congress, who are being treated rather harshly by their constituents. And the ones who have been quiet are taking note. And the third audience are the Democrats in Congress who have been, I can't say they haven't fought back because they have, but there's been a lack of intensity, shall we say, a lack of the moment. I think they've been waiting to see which way the wind is going to blow and whether Trump really is going to be able to hang on to his agenda. And so the more you can be noisy in Democratic districts, write your member, even though he doesn't have to worry about, or she'd have to worry about re-election. So those are the audiences for these protests, and I guarantee they're listening.
Well, I certainly hope you're right. What would your final, after all of this, beside your pessimism?
No, it's not really pessimism, because I view when things get worse, at some point, Americans will do the right thing. You know, how can you be an advocate for democracy, small d, and not trust your fellow citizens at some point to come to their senses. It was Aristotle who said, ordinary people know how the shoe fits. Right now, the shoe doesn't feel that tight. That could change. And it will change, given the scope of what's being done. And when it does change, my view is not at all pessimistic.
Good. Do we need to reinvent federalism, or is it just...
Yeah, you know, that's a funny one for me because, as I say, federalism in my mind, when I was getting my PhD, was associated with Jim Crow. But I've been really proud of the way governors and state legislators have stepped up, as well as federal district judges. They're being subjected to the kind of threats and violence that none of us can fully appreciate. I wish our governor in New Hampshire were keeping a little more distance from MAGA than she seems to be. And to me, the thing that's so weird is people fear for the safety of their children. How is it that banning books is a good idea in school libraries when all of these kids are online? It makes no sense to me. It's people are fearful. And remember that slide, Demonocracy? They identify a scapegoat. Okay, obscene books. And that's the thing they go after. But there's not necessarily any sense behind the target of that particular fear. How is people who are having trans surgery, just a tiny, minuscule proportion of the population, in any way a threat to my grandchildren? I don't see it, but I have to take seriously that other people are making these kinds of connections. So when I can engage people on that level, I will ask that question. Oh, does your child have a cell phone? Oh, how much porn are they watching? That gets them thinking. And to my way of thinking, when I'm around people, that's what I do. I ask a question. And the question, instead of saying, how could you think that? And this is where my training as a professor has been invaluable in dealing with these kinds of situations, because that's how I always dealt with idiocy in my classroom. Instead of saying, you're an idiot, or how could you think that, or you didn't do the reading and that's why you say that, I would always respond with a question. And it would often, and multiple questions typically, to get them to sort of say, oh, yeah, my kids could be exposed to porn, which is much worse than Johnny has 2 mommies.
Linda, we can't thank you much for your expertise and your wisdom. And this has been a very informative, and it gives us a lot to think about that we need to continue.
Well, I've just enjoyed sharing the podium with you. Thank you for coming. Can I tell my Congress story?
Yes.
Okay, this is the story I always end Introduction to American Politics with. I graduated in '67, and my husband was draft bait because he'd been to law school, and eventually he was sent to Parris Island as a Marine, not his choice. So I was coming full face with the fact that government can do things to me, and the Bill of Rights is not protecting them from protecting me from my husband going off to the rice paddies. And instead of sending him to the rice paddies, because he was an attorney, they sent him to headquarters of the Marine Corps. And he was part, get this, of the Nixon Commission to establish an all-volunteer army. And he worked as a staffer on that. And your sense of irony, I hope, is piqued by that situation. But so I ended up getting a job on Capitol Hill. And we'd just been through the riots. Martin Luther King had been assassinated, Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated, Lyndon Johnson had taken his name out of the running. It had been very chaotic. So when I get to Capitol Hill in 1969 and seeing what's going on, of members refusing to take roll call votes, these huge casualty lists that I had to respond to every day. But one night, I always worked late because that's what you do on Capitol Hill when you're young. I went down to get my car in the Rayburn garage, which is a vast, vast space. And instead of just my car there, it was full of Jeeps and armored vehicles and paratroopers from Fort Benning. There had been rumors all week in the Capitol that a domestic terrorist group called the Weathermen, which was an anti-war group and basically was blowing up research labs that were making Agent Orange and things at the University of Wisconsin, whatever. The Capitol had been abuzz all week about the Weathermen were coming, and the government was afraid. And here was the evidence of this fear of its own people, with all these paratroopers getting ready to patrol the big demonstration that was scheduled the next day against the war on Cambodia, the secret bombing war that had gone against Cambodia. I was dumbfounded. I got into my car and I started to cry because the government and the people had become so far apart. But you know what? I went to the demonstration the next day, Steve in his civilian glasses, because if you wore military glasses when you're in Washington in 1970, people would spit on you. And so we went to this demonstration, and it was a love fest. There were hundreds of thousands of people there, all shapes, sizes, ages, backgrounds, and whatever. And young people were cavorting in the reflecting pools, and people were linking arms, they were singing, and all of a sudden, the troops start coming out from the Rayburn building. The quiet descends on the crowd, and everybody's going, oh boy, here it goes. And they had water tanks. And they gave everybody a drink of water or sprayed them with cold water if they wanted, because it was a really hot May day. And so that's, I guess, and then of course, in the end, Congress finally found its voice and began to pass resolutions. And that demonstration did make a difference. And so did the water, because it sort of said, okay, space is opening up here. Mm-hmm. So I guess the lesson is, A, it's really scary when the government is afraid of its own people and starts to mobilize units to quell insurrections in cities. Isn't that what was just proposed yesterday by the Pentagon? So that's really scary. On the other hand, there are a lot of really good people in the military. They don't want to be firing on us. And if you stand your ground, maybe you'll create a space that eventually led the way to gradual withdrawing. But look at all the people who got hurt in that time. And the problem is democracy takes a long time, and a lot of people can fall through the cracks.
Thank you again. Let me remind everybody that there will be a discussion group on today's session at the Osher classrooms. Just go out the front door, go down one block, you'll see the building where the 3 Tomatoes is, and up on the 2nd and 3rd floor is where all the Osher classrooms are. So you can join that discussion if you would like. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks for coming.